good afternoon, morning, if you're in different time zones, or good day. My name is Aarti Khosla. I'm very pleased to welcome you all here on a session which is being organized by IISD. I personally work on communicating climate change, and I've done that for several years. So, a lot of issues that we are facing in the world today, some of us have seen a lot through lenses of climate action. That's also the purpose of this session today. While we are talking about how subsidies that are being provided for fossil fuel production and consumption are what eventually will determine the extent of support that is being given across the world for climate action and sustainable development, or are we going far from it? And this session assumes, again, importance in the geopolitical context as well. Those of us who have been privy to conversations that happened at the Energy Transition Working Group meetings in Goa not too long ago, in end of June, we saw how there was a tooth and nail fight to not include the phraseology on fossil fuel phase out across the world, while at the same time, countries across the world are also being battered by one form of the climate crisis or another. So you cannot say more than at least just acknowledging that a lot of the climate crisis is unfolding ahead of us more than how climate models had predicted them. But at the same time, a lot of geopolitical alliances are shaping up. The decisions are being made not just on issues which were important in the erstwhile era, but decisions are also being made on new areas of concern like supply chain, like essential critical minerals, so on and so forth. The sum and substance of all of this is that trying to just simply understand how much still countries that are talking about climate action are also supporting, on the other hand, the production and consumption of fossil fuels across the world is something that is going to give us a clear idea of how climate action is being understood across the world. Today's study, which has been done by extensive work by some of our colleagues who are also here to present and talk about it, not just talks about this whole issue of production and consumption subsidies for fossil fuels, but it's also a call to action in some ways for G20, which is less than 3 weeks away and has a lot of expectations on what it will deliver on energy transition goals, how it will make climate finance easier, and what will it do to facilitate faster and rapid climate action, both by the big GDP member countries as well as by emerging economy countries of G20. That's really the context in which we want to spend the next hour and a half. The flow of the show will mostly be as follows. We will first have the lead presentation by Tara Lan, who's the lead author of the study and also a senior associate at IISD. Big congrats to you, Tara, for landing this report very nicely. We are already seeing it's getting covered in press as we speak, and definitely this is going to be the talk of the G20 conversations as the Sherpa meetings also happen in Delhi within the next 10 days or so, and the leaders summit thereafter. After the presentation by Tara, we will get on to the panel discussion. And before I explain further, I'm also very pleased to welcome all of our colleagues who have taken time to join us today, but are also people who have worked on the subject at length and will be able to speak about the implications of the study as such on the G20 conversations. I welcome Matthew Watkinson, who's the Executive Director of Current Analysis and Economic Research at Environment and Climate Change Department, Government of Canada. We also have Daila Havila, who's the Program Officer at IRENA, International Renewable Energy Agency. We have Nate Vernon, who is an economist at the International Monetary Fund, IMF. And we have Livy Gervais, who's a policy advisor at the Institute of Socioeconomics in Brazil. We will get to our panel in a short while, but before further ado, may I ask you, Tara, to please take it away, present some of the findings, and talk about what you have been putting together, I imagine, for quite a few months now, and is very important at this moment, at least, as we talk about sustainable development. Over to you.
Sorry, I'll just share my screen. Thanks, Arti. And start my presentation. Right, so my presentation today really sort of was a long time in the making in some ways. I first started working on fossil fuel subsidies back in 2009. And that's when we at IISD started a new work program on quantifying subsidies and advocating for their reform. So you can imagine our, sorry, I'm just trying to change my slide here. You can imagine our surprise and delight then when later that year, only a few months after sort of really commencing our work program, the G20 committed to phase out and rationalise fossil fuel subsidies. And we thought, well, brilliant, this is maybe job done. You know, what does it mean for our program? This is a big outcome. But we knew that more would be involved in implementing this commitment. And, you know, so we continued with our work program. And what we saw was growing commitments to phase out fossil fuel subsidies from APEC under the Sustainable Development Goals, from the G7 and under the Paris Agreement, where in 2015, parties pledged to make financial flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions. So this includes presumably public and private financial flows, which would include subsidies. And then more explicitly at COP26 and COP27, there was a commitment to phase out fossil fuel subsidies. So therefore, I wish I was presenting today a report entitled Mission Accomplished, how the G20 eliminated fossil fuel subsidies. But actually here we are all these years later with a report entitled The G20 Provides Record Financial Support for Fossil Fuels. And so what our report does is it brings together all the latest data on public financial flows to fossil fuels. And we also bring together some data on renewable energy support and renewable energy investment. So turning now to the results, we have found that total financial support for fossil fuels reached a record 1.4 trillion in 2022. So this is the sum of the different types that I'll go through in a minute and provide a bit more detail. So international public finance, capital expenditure by state-owned enterprises, and different types of subsidies. And you can see that you know, the graph speaks for itself. We've seen a massive increase in support in 2022. So turning to subsidies, what we found was that fossil fuel subsidies from G20 countries amounted to at least $1 trillion in 2022. I say at least because it's often hard to quantify all fossil fuel subsidies due to lack of data and so on. And this was 4 times higher than the annual average over the previous decade. So as you can see, just a massive increase in 2022. And this was driven by vast consumption subsidies in response to the energy crisis. Now, it's understandable that during a crisis, governments need to intervene to assist their citizens. But what we know is that fossil fuel subsidies are an extremely inefficient way to assist the poor and to provide sort of social welfare. And this is simply because those who use the most fuel often harness the most benefits. And this is more crazy the more you think about it. I mean, why should the amount of help you get from the government be directly proportional to the amount of fossil fuel you use? It just makes no sense. So what we recommend countries do is remove these subsidies and use the savings to provide targeted welfare to those who need it most. And with this one kind of policy change, you could reduce emissions and you could also address poverty much more effectively. Now, another really important form of support that we quantified in this study is investments in fossil fuel infrastructure by state-owned enterprises, which amounted to 322 billion in 2022. So just to explain this, this is government-owned companies or government-controlled companies, majority-owned, that then invest in fossil fuel production. So this is a massive down payment by these government-owned enterprises in new fossil fuel production. And it's only going to increase. So what we found is that the level is it's higher than anything we've seen in the recent years before the energy crisis, and going back to around 2015. And it's going to increase. We know that national oil companies are doubling down because of the massive profits that they made in 2022 and are now planning to invest more in future fossil fuel production. So many of these are all governments that have committed to aligning financial flows with low greenhouse gas emissions, and yet their companies are investing in new fossil fuels. And this is completely at odds with what we know about the climate science. And the IEA, the International Energy Agency, declared back in 2021 that to be consistent with a pathway of keeping temperatures, average global temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius, there can, from today, be no new investment in fossil fuel supply projects. No investment in new fossil fuel supply projects. So we know that this can't be happening to be consistent with the Paris Agreement, and yet it still is and is increasing. International public financing for fossil fuels has been declining over recent years, but is still averaging around 50 billion per year. Now, it has been declining, but it's still 4 times greater than the support we're seeing for clean energy. And that support for clean energy is not increasing at the same rate. So really, there is plenty of scope here for governments to switch the current international financing for fossil fuels towards international financing for clean energy. I mean, financing fossil fuels internationally locks these countries into further reliance on fossil fuels with all the attendant problems. The price volatility, the air pollution, greenhouse gas emissions, and so on. So the last issue I want to talk about in relation to fossil fuel support is under taxation. So the reason why I call it under taxation is because we know that fossil fuels have major impacts on our environment and our society, and these have big social costs. So as an example, air pollution makes people very ill, and that has costs, health costs for governments, but also for individuals, and also reduces productivity of people. So these are all measurable real costs that are occurring as a result of us using fossil fuels. Now, in the case of carbon emissions, therefore we should have taxation that reflects these social costs. And that would have 2 effects. One would be to encourage consumers and investors to switch away from fossil fuels and choose cleaner alternatives. And the other would be to generate revenue, which can be used to address some of these impacts. And we know that in the case of carbon emissions, that we need a carbon price of around $100 per tonne CO2 by 2030 to address the climate impacts that we're seeing and try and reduce the worst of global warming. So you can see from this chart here that only the EU members of the G20 are currently achieving carbon pricing of this level. At this level, all other G20 members could increase their carbon taxation, need to increase their carbon taxation to try and use taxation as a way to reduce fossil fuel use and again generate those revenues that can be used to ameliorate the impacts. So what we did was look at exactly how much revenue could be generated, and we considered a carbon floor proposed by the International Monetary Fund of US $25 per tonne for low-income countries, up to $75 a tonne for high-income countries. So this is a floor, a carbon price floor. And if the G20 implemented this floor, so moved from current levels of taxation to these levels of taxation just on carbon, it could raise $1 trillion per year. So that's a vast amount of money that could be used for other for purposes like a just energy transition, social welfare, and so on. So turning now to renewable energy, there is no current global data available on actual spending on renewable energy subsidies per year that's recent. So what we did instead was draw on data from the International Energy Agency and some other sources, and we found that announced pledges for renewable energy support equaled around 265 billion over a 3-year period. And this is fantastic news. I mean, it's great to see this support for renewable energy. The US Inflation Reduction Act is obviously a huge commitment, and that's why the US is at the top of the list there. But we have to remember this is commitments, not annual spending. So it might be actually spent over the next 20 years. And it is also over a 3-year period, that 265 billion. So it's around 88 billion per year, I think. And it's not hard to do the maths. We know that the G20 spent around $1 trillion in fossil fuel subsidies in 2022. And so we're talking, about a tenfold increase of support going to fossil fuels versus renewables. Now, there is plenty of scope, therefore, to shift public financial support from fossil fuels to renewables. Governments are providing these funds, and they can just move it across to renewable energy. So global investments in renewables is another fantastic news story. Investments in renewables reached a record high of 500 billion in 2022. Around 83% of this was in the G20, and around 30% of that was the public sector. So it's really good to see this ramping up of investment in renewables. Still, we have to have perspective on this, and it's still only around half of what's currently going to new fossil fuel production and power generation. So we know that investment in renewables needs to increase by about 3 times to be consistent with a 1.5 degree temperature increase globally. So again, there is a lot of scope for governments to shift their public investments towards clean energy, and that can be used to catalyse private investment as well. So I just want to, this is my second to last slide. I just want to give some perspective about the size of the numbers we're talking about. I mean, with fossil fuel subsidies, people say hundreds of billions, trillions. It's difficult to picture, right? What does this mean in terms of public money? So we know the G20 spent 1.4 trillion in 2022 on fossil fuels, supporting fossil fuels, and could raise another trillion from carbon taxation per year. So we found that just a quarter of this money, shifting just a quarter of it, could close the renewable energy investment gap, go towards ending world hunger, provide universal access to electricity and clean cooking, and close the climate finance investment gap in developing countries. So, and that's just a quarter of it, right? That would leave the remaining funding available for social welfare to mitigate the impacts of higher energy prices. There's the mind boggles. You could use it for promoting economic growth, job programs, etc. So finally, what can the G20 do to change course? Well, of course, eliminating all public financial flows to fossil fuels would be a good start, and expanding the current sort of definition of subsidies, eliminating subsidies, should go further to include investments by state-owned enterprises and public financing, setting a minimum carbon tax, and using the revenues from fossil fuel subsidy reform and carbon taxation to provide support to low-income households and rapidly scale up clean energy. And also to ensure that fossil fuel dependent communities have a just energy transition. Thank you very much. I'm here for questions, obviously, and looking forward to the panel discussion.
Thanks very much, Tara. I think it's both sobering as well as fascinating, and your last but one slide really sticks out. And I wanted to ask you about especially at a moment where climate and energy issues have become fairly important in a lot of geopolitical conversations. It's heavily discussed at the G20, as we are talking about. It was discussed at G7. We are sitting today where the BRICS heads of states are meeting, and climate and energy will also sit in one form or the other across that grouping as well. And I wanted to ask you on how the implications of such big numbers are to these geopolitical conversations. Are we just are we just creating call to action, or do we really think that we can go over the line and make some impact in terms of what can be changed in the real world? Because it's quite clear from a lot of what you presented that Russia and Ukraine and security issues are a big part of the reason, but there is also something about entrenched ways of working, and which is why to be able to dislodge that is one thing as well. That's my question to you, and if you could respond briefly. But I also see that in the chat there was a specific question, if you could just combine the both, which was if you could talk more about what consumer subsidies mean, like what forms of subsidies do you refer to when you see consumer subsidies?
Okay, well, I might take your question first, Ati. So they're obviously we've seen fossil fuel subsidies and commitments to remove fossil fuel subsidies emerging, from a lot of different forums, and some of them are more meaningful than others in terms of, like, the G7, for example, made a commitment to reduce to eliminate subsidies by 2025. So at least we have a deadline there. I think we've seen a lot of commitments, and now it's just really time to see the implementation. So I always think international commitments are fantastic because climate change is a global problem, so we need to have global cooperation. So it's good to see collective action at the international level, and it can be a very useful way to drive reform at the domestic level, because leaders can say, look, we've committed to this in the international arena, all of our peers are committed to doing this, therefore we have to do it, and it helps drive reform. But at the end of the day, reform has to be made domestically. It has to be about regulations and policies put in place by leaders in their home countries to actually implement these decisions. And that's exactly what we're lacking at the moment on fossil fuels. I don't think we need more international commitments. And I think that we've seen that, these commitments don't necessarily result in a lot of action. So there's a couple of ways the G20, for example, can make a difference, and that would be to put in place a deadline to remove these sorts of subsidies, to remove the word inefficient. So language does matter, and or at least more narrowly define that term to include, say, targeting just energy subsidies to the poor. So there is definitely more that these international bodies can do to provide more detailed guidance about what is required. But at the end of the day, it's the countries that need to act in their own national interest and make these changes. So just going to the second question from the audience, consumer subsidies have two main forms. Well, not two main forms. There are two main categories in the way that we quantify consumer subsidies. One of them is, the biggest category probably, is price support, and that is when a government caps a retail price below the cost of supply or below the international market price. So an example might be, say, Saudi Arabia, the gasoline price is 60 cents a litre, the international price is $1 a litre. That gap is price support. The government is foregoing revenue that it could have made by selling that, by allowing that gasoline to be sold in the open market. That's the biggest form of consumer consumption subsidy that we see, and is more common in emerging economies and developing economies. Now, that's not to say that there aren't also vast consumer subsidies provided at those above market prices. So what I'm talking about here are tax cuts, excise tax cuts on gasoline and diesel. We saw that a lot during the energy crisis. Government transfers to help people with their heating bills, big transfers to keep gas prices low, and so on. So that's the kind of consumption subsidy that we might see more in developed economies, and hundreds of billions were spent along those lines during the energy crisis. So there's no one's really provided no subsidies across the G20, and most of it's been consumer subsidies of those kinds.
Thanks very much, Tara. I'm conscious of wanting to keep moving, but I see there are several questions in the Q&A. Maybe we will come to them when we have the Q&A session, or if there are some that you can answer in writing, please do so. But enough in all of what you said. And, while the number itself is a staggering 1.4 trillion, I suppose the fact that we don't need more international commitments, but what we need, as you said, is countries taking steps in the right direction. Perhaps, just gives me a cue to bring Matthew Watkinson from the Environment and Energy Department from the Government of Canada. And Matthew, uh, we all know that while Canada had promised to scrap fossil fuel subsidies some years ago, 14, 15 years ago, it's now that the country has taken a big step in the right direction to have a framework on how you're going to really implement the commitment. And looking at all of these figures and data and analysis, would you like to say a little more on how did Canada achieve this? What were the political economy challenges? And if I am allowed, I also want to include a second part of my question, which is there is still a lot of capacity to fund fossil fuels in the system. As you see, Canada still supports a lot of oil and gas projects. You give tax breaks, grants, etc., and that could be a potential loophole. Do you have any views on how this could be stopped from becoming a loophole in the future? And what do you think the importance of this is, especially when we are looking at G20? Sorry to make it really long, but political economy questions, something to do with how to prevent loopholes and what does it really mean for the G20?
Sure. Yeah, no, I can sort of take those in that order, maybe. So starting with political economy or overcoming the challenges and barriers to getting a clear policy with some clear definitions and like really quite a clear sense of what the government will support and not support in the fossil fuel sector. So starting with that, like I guess the first thing I would note on that is that there was a clear political will, like there were very public commitments on the part of the government to deliver this in 2023, 2 years ahead of the 2025 G20 deadline. So that always makes the work of putting it together, it puts more onus on it, makes it a priority, and allows the resources to flow to do that work. At the officials level, I think the story is one of following sort of the classic policy development steps. We had an expert report produced, we had public consultations, we had a lot of interdepartmental discussion. We tried to take a whole of government approach to this. So this policy was co-developed with the Department of Finance, as well as Environment and Climate Change Canada, with strong involvement from key departments like our Natural Resources Department was a key partner. A lot of our industry department that administers a lot of programming in this space. The folks working in various research programs that have elements that touch the fossil fuel sector. And I think those interdepartmental discussions are really, really important when you're trying to come up with something that you can put out there as a government and stand behind and implement. The people writing that policy and coming up with those definitions and administering that on a go-forward basis, it's really important for them to understand in a fair amount of detail how those programs work and function and the work that they've done to date. One thing that we found fairly consistently is that program administrators were doing the hard work of evolving their approaches to align with increasing government ambition in climate. And so a lot of what we were doing, a lot of what we had a head start kind of on a lot of these things. So I think our framework, just maybe to move to your second point about loopholes or closing loopholes, I think what we have put forward has a couple of important elements that address that. First of all, it has very clear definitions underneath its exemption criteria. So it's as you say, it allows for continuing support of the fossil fuel sector and its efforts to decarbonize, and that's the key element of the policy. And I think that's in line largely with the direction of the G20 commitment in terms of how it's G20 commitment specifically mentions technologies that significantly reduce emissions, clean technology, etc. So our sort of 6 exemption criteria, like I'll just run through them super quickly. So anything that results in significant net GHG reductions, clean energy, clean tech, essential energy services for remote communities, also sort of very much in line with the G20 language, short-term emergency support, supporting Indigenous economic participation, which is an important piece, and abated production processes or projects with a credible net zero plan. So behind all of those are like a fairly exhaustive set of definitions that I think work well to eliminate the risk of these exemption criteria being used as loopholes for support that's sort of outside the spirit and intent of the framework. So like, for example, the definition of a remote community is quite specific and mentions things like, you know, it has to be a community that's not connected to the power grid, etc. So it's circumscribed fairly carefully. Indigenous economic participation is one that we got, you know, face questions on in terms of how that would work and be operationalized. And really, we have tried to make clear the intent behind that being like, we in Canada, participation in the sector by Indigenous groups is like their ability to invest in a project in the fossil fuel sector or the energy sector. In some instances involves like support to them from the Crown. And so like we were pretty clear that the intention is like we want to avoid an unintended consequence of preventing them from participating in the sector. But that doesn't mean that any project of any stripe, even if it's offside with the framework in other ways, would be able to be supported by the government just because it involves some form of Indigenous investment. The intent is really the intent is really to avoid that unintended consequence of like and protect the ability of the Crown to support First Nations in their participation in the sector. So like throughout the framework, the terms are well defined, and that was like the subject of fairly intensive whole of government discussion and interdepartmental discussion, and that was sort of a key thing to moving forward. And part of that, I think, as well, is like sort of having underneath those discussions a shared understanding of you know, how we're viewing net zero consistency, how that evolves over time, and understanding that that's obviously a very complicated question, and it's fraught with a lot of uncertainty. And so when you're putting something out there now, it's difficult to close the door completely on technologies that are still largely unknown, like, or where there are still question marks. So like one of the features of our framework and guidance that we published is like a clear statement of intent to like periodically review and ensure that we're maintaining alignment with like technologies as they emerge and government priorities as they emerge. There's the ability to look back. And I've forgotten the third element of your question. There was an element of sort of challenges.
No, you answered quite a lot. I was asking if some of this framework details could be adopted by G20. Are there any implications for other G20 countries?
Yes.
Feel free to briefly address that one.
Sure. Yeah. No, I guess I would just say that like we use the G20 commitment as our foundation and our starting point. We annex that commitment word for word in our public documents. So we feel like we're fairly closely aligned. We took the step of publishing that and putting it out there for all to see. And so like if people in other countries have an interest in discussing that with us, we're always open to that, appreciating that all countries have their own unique circumstances and governance processes, and everybody's going to be a little bit different. But I think like for us, the transparency piece was an important step.
Thanks very much, Matthew. There was lots what you said, and especially the part about new technology. And we saw, even when the G7 meetings ended in Japan, early this year, there is huge focus on how you can actually focus on new tech, whether it is ammonia, which can be used as a feedstock in coal power plants, or it's hydrogen, where you cannot ascertain whether it's actually leading to less emissions or more. And I suppose there is just more and more room for all of these kinds of diversionary and distracting technologies, which can be clubbed as solutions, but in reality are false. And I suppose we will have to deal with these whack-a-moles as they come. We are dealing with the fossil fuel subsidy as one big problem, and in the whole process of transition, just the ability of the world to not tackle solutions, not tackle problems with real solutions, but false solutions, looks like the way it is going, but perhaps that's the thing that needs to be avoided. Right now, we don't want to focus a lot on that. We will keep going, but I take your point on how, even within the G20 framework, if this can be encouragement to other countries, then it is really embedded in your principles on how you're trying to take this forward in Canada, at least. Thanks very much. I'm taking cues from what Tara really presented in the beginning. And if I could bring you in, Nate, especially how the IMF talks a lot about social costs as an implicit fossil fuel subsidy. And here we are straddling an issue where, due to Russia-Ukraine conflict, due to energy security issues, we've had governments facing the challenge of rising energy prices and have to forego building those prices up. And as a result, so many consumer subsidies were given last year. But on the other hand, it's pretty clear that fossil fuel subsidies just bring environmental havoc. I think we can just speak at length for the rest of this webinar on how they perpetuate so much social inequity. They just bring ill health. There are numbers that are given from various kinds of agencies that talk about how air pollution causes deaths between 1 to 10 million throughout the year, and those are avoided deaths. And so on the one hand, there is all of the social costs of fossil fuels, which are not incorporated in the real price. And on the other hand is the political economy challenge of a lot of the countries on how to deal with rising fuel prices as that stand even today, and how to tackle supply and inflation. Why, do you think the IMF believes that government should increase fossil fuel prices well above their cost of supply, and how do you justify all of this in the political economy conversation?
Thank you for your question. So I'll start by discussing the piece on social costs, and then can just briefly mention on political economy and inflation in general. So the true cost, or the full cost, of fossil fuel consumption, as you mentioned, includes
Nate,
Sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Sorry. So the true cost of fossil fuel consumption includes both the supply cost plus any external costs that consumption imposes on others. These external costs, or externalities, include things like air pollution, global warming damages, and traffic congestion. People are willing to pay for reductions in these, but it's difficult for individuals to force others to pay for or compensate them for their external costs. And that's where the role of government and corrective taxes come in. So through corrective taxation, or taxes on these external costs, governments can make businesses and people pay for or internalize the costs they impose on others, in addition to the supply costs. And this results in these externalities only occurring when the benefit to consumers exceeds the full cost of consumption, which improves the allocation of resources across the economy, raises revenue, and results in the economically efficient level of externalities. These external costs, and so in our measure of subsidies, we measure both the undercharging for supply costs and the external costs. And in a paper that update to our work that we'll release tomorrow, we showed that current prices are routinely set at levels that do not are far from reflecting the external and supply costs at a magnitude of about 7% of GDP or $7 trillion in 2022, which, as Tara mentioned, reflects a large increase from previous years. And most of these subsidies are related to undercharging for the external costs. So what these subsidies result in are environmental damages like global warming, local air pollution deaths, and traffic congestions far above economically efficient levels. And we estimate that corrective taxes would save over 1.5 million lives a year from premature deaths that are caused by fossil fuel use. Also, raising revenue through corrective taxation allows governments to rely less on distortive taxes, like taxes on work effort and investment. And we estimate that these corrective taxes would raise around 3% of GDP in revenue, so provide much more fiscal space to governments. And I think that leads a bit into this discussion on inflationary impacts. So first thing which Tara mentioned is that a portion of the fiscal savings from reform can be used to fully compensate vulnerable or poor households from the increase in energy prices. This is important for equity concerns as well as political acceptability. And it still leaves some revenue left over for other uses. But also the design of price reform matters for the inflationary impacts. So just a few principles here. It's important to phase in these price increases, whether it's removal of explicit subsidies or increases in taxes over time. So slowly increase the policy stringency and communicate that price trajectory well in advance to households and firms. A second design principle is that, if possible, price increases can be timed to correspond with falling international fossil fuel prices, and this can dampen the increase in post-tax prices as well as support political acceptability. So the currently high international prices, which are expected to fall, at least according to futures markets, provide a potential opportunity for this. And third, the governments can use a portion of the savings to invest in public goods that provide alternatives to fossil fuels, such as public transportation. This can reduce the inflationary impact by lowering the amount of spending that households use on fossil fuels. So those are a few principles around managing the inflationary impact, as well as why we consider the corrective taxation to capture social costs quite important fiscally, economically, and environmentally.
Thanks very much, Nate. I'm just, wondering on all of what you said, and these principles are very useful. And if I can parse this a little bit further, because the decisions on evaluating when to increase consumer energy prices is also driven in a lot of countries by elections, by political motives, and all of those concerns. And the last point that you made about how you can invest in other social safety net services, public good, etc. I wanted to ask you if you could respond to this very briefly. Do you still believe that, sorry, maybe the better way to frame it is, do you think that the discussions on energy prices can also be linked to adjacent issues like education, healthcare, and the broader safety net, or should it just be very focused and the way it is right now?
So I think the key point or overlap, or probably the key overlap here, is related to the fiscal savings from removing explicit subsidies and applying corrective taxation. This creates an enormous amount of revenue for governments, and governments can decide how to use that, of course. Ideally, a portion would be used through these kind of targeted cash transfers. Not all governments have the infrastructure in place to provide cash transfers, but that's the first best way to protect vulnerable households. But it leaves a large portion of revenue left over. And it's important if these systems are not in place to at least route public spending towards goods and services that are disproportionately used by the poor and promote sustainable development goals. So there's a lot of overlap here in just the level of the fiscal savings from price reform and what that can be used for. I'll stop there.
Thanks, that's useful. We will try and come back to this if there are more questions from the audience, because I suppose that's where the rubber hits the road. When you increase consumer prices for energy, that brings in various kinds of public protest, whichever country you look at, whether it was the Gilets Jaunes in France, a couple of years ago, or I live in India, and the implications of even slight consumer price rise on electricity is so huge and large that nobody wants to touch it a year before election time. And I suppose between these two examples, there are several other examples in parts of Africa where it's just not possible to do, and how to really move ahead. But certainly, as you said, there is huge fiscal space that is created if the G20 were to able to do it in some form or fashion. I will keep going and the shift gears a little bit at this moment. And Diala, if I can invite you. In the presentation that we saw, whilst it was clear that the international finance for fossil fuels, international finance is coming down, it's still 4 times more than renewables, if I understood it correctly. But that said, there are also several numbers, several analyses by various think tanks, international organizations that are coming each day that talk about how much investment is actually needed into renewable energy per year. And I suppose the best estimates will be even close to double the subsidy figure that we are looking at in this report, the amount of annual investments that are needed for setting up or deploying renewables for us to be compliant with Paris targets or compliant with 1.5 goals. Clearly, we are on a counter track, and while we can celebrate that there is a lot of renewable energy deployment and scaling up happening across the world, it's clear that the fossil fuel subsidies are skewing investments in some way. Do you believe that that kind of skew is happening, and that's quite protracted and deliberate, which means that fossil fuel subsidies are skewing investments away from renewable energy? And what types of public financial support you think are most distorting in terms of impeding the adoption of renewable energy, especially in G20 countries?
Thank you very much, Arti, for your questions. And also thank you to Tara for the report that she just presented and the presentation. Very impactful numbers and very, it really tells a very alarming story, what we just saw in Tara's presentation earlier today. So just to go about the renewable energy investment numbers. So as Tara mentioned, in 2022 was a record high year for investments in renewable energy. We hit $500 billion, but this is important. It's important to see that this number is global. And if we look at what the numbers that I represented earlier, just a bit less than that, 440 billion went into fossil fuel investments only from G20 countries. And if we look at fossil fuel investments globally, they are double what's going into renewables. So this is only investments going into assets, into fossil fuel assets or renewable renewable energy assets. Now, if we zoom into the renewable energy investments, we see also Tara said that a third of those are public investments. So also if we look at, so those are still global, but if we look at all those investments, 83% of them are in G20. So it is a bit safe to say that the trends that we see globally, we can say are applicable to the G20. So when we look at those public investments, we see that state-owned financial institutions provide an average $52 billion. And these are in 2020, those are the latest numbers that we have. National DFIs also provide 25% of these investments. And state-owned enterprises provided in 2020 $11 billion. So $11 billion state-owned enterprises in renewables. And if we look at what Tara presented earlier, 322 billion in fossil fuels. So you see how dwarfed renewable energy investments are compared to fossil fuels, especially when we look at the public investments. Now, there is also another trend that we see in the global landscape of renewable energy finance report. When we look at investments made, so the sources of investment, what comes from private and what comes from public investments, we see that although 30% in general is the trend for renewable energy in general, the breakdown between public and private finance differs by technology. So for example, in solar PV, 83% comes from the private sector, and all the way to hydropower, where 97% comes from public investments. So why is this important? If we look again at the global investments in renewables, we see more and more concentration, not only in developed countries, but also in developed technologies. So solar PV, onshore and offshore wind are almost accounting for 97% of investments. So overall, we are relying more on private investments to drive the energy transition, but private investments only go to countries with reliable markets, so developed markets, and also developed technologies. So we are seeing that we are leaving, although there's a lot of progress made, this progress is made only in the power sector because those are the mature technologies and only in developed markets. So we're leaving a large chunk of the globe outside of the energy transition. 15% of investments only go to half of the world's population. And more importantly, or as importantly, we're leaving a large chunk of the energy transition in terms of end uses outside of the energy transition, right? So heating and cooling, transport, where we need a lot of investments, we're not receiving any. And this is the role of the public sector, right? To go where the private sector doesn't want to go to risky environments, to go to risky technologies. And here we are seeing that the public sector is lagging behind. So we are calling for higher investments from the public sector towards those technologies and those markets. And those markets becomes much more alarming when you look at investments per capita that goes into renewables. So if you look at investments per capita in North America and in Europe, and you look at investments per capita in, for example, Sub-Saharan Africa, you see that the discrepancy is huge, and the discrepancy is increasing with time. And again, this is because we are relying more and more on private sector to drive the energy transition. So per capita investments in Europe were 22 times higher Sub-Saharan Africa in 2015, and now they are 40 times higher. Between North America and Sub-Saharan Africa, we went from 23 times higher in 2015 to 57 times higher in 2021. So this is where the public investments are needed to go to areas where the public sector doesn't want to go, and to change this narrative that public investments are only needed to close gaps or to attract private investments. No, they are needed for a bigger role than that. And also to go back to the G20 countries, it's not only that we rely on investments that happen in G20 G20 countries, in order to achieve an energy transition that is just and equitable, we need to see flows of public finance from the global north to the global south. So, and if we look at the breakdown that we have in public investments, we see that multilateral and bilateral investments are going down with time. And if the SDG 7 tracking report showed us that investments, international public flows of investments in renewables they peaked in 2017 at $26 billion. But in 2021, this is the latest number we have, it went down to $10.8 billion. So only 10.8 is flowing from the global north to the global south to help deploy renewable energy, where it is needed not only for climate, obviously not climate purposes, but also for socioeconomic development and bridging energy poverty and energy access gaps. So we see that there's a very large role to play in public investments, and as we see that it's all going into the wrong places. It's going to subsidize fossil fuels, either in terms of investments or in terms of subsidies. But just one last point I would like to make is that all those investment numbers that we are presenting in our reports, or that I just mentioned now, are going into assets. We are not mentioning the support, the government support that goes into enabling environment, creating enabling environments. And here, for example, investing in infrastructure like grids, or investing in R&D, which is very needed to push the energy transition in end uses, heating and cooling and transport, and also to create a just transition. So all those structural changes that are going to be needed. So those are not accounted for in the investments that we talk about, especially when we talk about tripling the amount of investments needed. It's actually much more than that. So tripling investments is in the assets, but in order to create an enabling environment and to have a just transition, it's much more than just tripling. And a lot of the money that is now going into subsidizing fossil fuels or into the fossil fuel industry will be needed to be channeled into that enabling environment. I will stop here, but I will answer any other questions that you might have.
Yes, thanks very much. I mean, what you said was both fascinating as well as quite depressing, I must say. It just feels that the scale of the problem is so enormous, and what we are doing is not even touching the tip of the iceberg. I don't want to labor on how experts like yourself just keep talking about de-risking projects so that more money can come, but correct me if I'm wrong, just the entire amount of private investment that has come into renewables, more than 75% will just be solar panels or solar, because that's just considered as, one easy tried and tested technology. You can put money into it. It's past that stage and it's easy and possible. But what about the other end users, as you say, and what about creating an enabling environment? And I want to ask one question before I move further, because it just feels that this is really the stuff that the G20 should be talking about, and we are far, far away from it. If there are one or two wins or successes that you think are possible within this G20, especially to enable more finance towards either clean energy or more finance for energy investments, what are the one or two top things that the G20 could still do? And I'm saying this in the spirit that the Sherpa meeting is still about to happen and the Leader Summit is still about to happen, even if the meetings of the ministers of energy and the ministers of environment have concluded about a month ago. Can we expect there can be some hope in the next 2 or 3 weeks to at least have some kind of adequacy in looking at finance from a G20 perspective? Because otherwise, the scale of the problem, as you have outlined, is just manic.
Yes, thank you, Arti. I mean, it's not all bad news, of course. We are now focusing on what needs to be done, and its scale is huge, as you mentioned. But there are also some wins and some success stories that we see. The first one, and it is very difficult to talk about one policy or one solution, but the most important message that we like to convey is that it is a very comprehensive, let's say, mix of policies, and that is very intertwined. So those policies, they all interact with each other, but they also interact not only with the energy sector, but with the energy sector and the economy, the society, and the planet. And it's when we see this as a holistic take an approach, a holistic approach to this, and we put the just element or the just transition element at the center of it, this is when we start really the real discussion, and this is when we start getting somewhere. So it's not really a matter of suggesting one solution. It is suggesting an approach that is very holistic, and that is really looks at how the different policies interact with each other and with the different layers that we are dealing with. But just as having said that, another element that is very important, especially in the discussions that are happening now, are the need for structural change, because the structural change is at the center of this whole holistic framework that I just mentioned. So just the fact that we are starting to mention the structural changes that need to happen, how we approach inequalities. I mean, I think that it is only now that we are really starting to put energy together with inequality, together with solving issues like poverty. So we are really starting to put these issues together. And again, the calls for restructuring international financing and the whole financing structure and how we are discussing these so openly these days, I think this is a good starting point. So we're really starting to put emphasis on the structural changes that are needed, where we are really starting to put energy at the center of broader issues and global issues and inequality and injustice at the center of it. And I think these are the two strongest elements that will get a real discussion going and that will get us where we need to go.
Thanks very much. And I can't agree more. A couple of years ago, different issues were important in the geopolitical arena. And today, in every kind of an important summit or a meeting, whether it's, the Gs or the COPs or whichever kinds of other alliances you have, Quad and whatever else, climate and energy are really featuring on top. And I suppose that's our chance to make sure that whatever we are saying is loud and clear and logical and coherent for it to at least be accepted to some level, because it really just makes sense in the current situation that we are in. And there are a lot of questions and comments that I'm seeing. Feel free to answer some of them, and I'll keep moving. But what I wanted to also bring attention was to this whole thing of how whilst we are talking about fossil fuel subsidies, subsidies being given for increasing production, subsidies being given to the consumers, there is also this whole new way of looking at abatement and how are we going to address that issue. And before that becomes another big elephant in the room, because suddenly it feels that, while fossil fuels are not going to go away anywhere soon, there will be masked, and there will be cosmetic changes that will be made, and they will be called something else. There will be new hydrogen schemes and pushes that will be launched. There will be lots that will be done on reducing emissions and not reducing fossil fuels as such. And that's also my general observation and request to the panel, that if you want to come subsequently in, it will be nice to hear on how you look at these distractions and whether support that is being given for these solutions like carbon capture, like ammonia co-firing, like hydrogen that is not green, what do you think, where in the subsidies framework do they fit? Because I suppose that's hugely important in at least the energy policy situation that a lot of the emerging countries would be in. Suddenly, hydrogen will be the Hail Mary for all sorts of problems, and what can be done to address these new issues while we haven't solved the older ones. But I have to bring you in, Livy, and my obvious question to you, first of all, is that because we are talking of moments around G20, already there is a lot of discussion of the Troika, Indonesia, India, Brazil. Brazil is going to be the host of G20 next year. Do you have already any indications on how energy priorities might look for Brazil as it's in the presidency year? And also, given that a lot of the political changes happened in Brazil as well, are there any reflections that you have on how they have affected energy transition. We see that in the report there is a case study or a story where Brazil is featured as a country which dramatically increased solar and wind capacity in recent years. And is there more to be said on what the government needs to do on supporting Brazil's energy transition? Quite conscious that thankfully and pleasantly, you at least don't have a lot of coal, but you have other problems of the Amazon and the big implications. So a lot of combination questions. G20 host for the next year, what the priorities will look like in energy, what the recent changes on the politics have meant for energy transition, and what, according to you, are one or two of the main things on energy transition that are happening in Brazil?
Hi, nice to meet you all, and thank you for the invitation, for being here. I think these questions are very good for us to understanding how to move forward in terms of the G20. And we are very excited about Brazil taking the leadership, because it is a leader globally in the energy transition. We have one of the cleanest energy matrix in the world. So we are positioned to be a leader in the world in this arena. And I'm certain that the government will put this as one of the priorities, maybe sustainability as a whole and not energy specifically. As you said, we have a lot of other issues in the climate and sustainability agenda. We have the Amazon deforestation. We still have a lot of forests. So it's energy, I think, will be maybe not in the center of the role, but of course it will be an important part of the whole sustainability and climate action agenda for Brazil in the G20. I think going forward to the recent policies and what has been going on, I think it's very important to understand that there is, in fact, a transition in terms of government. Now we have a government that is much more committed to the climate agenda, both nationally and mostly internationally. Of course, always saying that the different responsibilities that developing countries have in this fight. Lula is always saying that, and we think it's very important as well. And in terms of what has been going on, I think it's very important to understand that there has been a big push for renewables in the last couple of years through the National Bank, as we said in the report, but also in this new government. Of course, with these commitments, there is a push for renewables, hydrogen, green hydrogen mostly. Offshore wind is also a big agenda for Brazil, and biomass as well. I think these are the three pushes, the three most important agendas for renewables. So we are seeing this push for more and more renewable production, and that is great. But I think it's also important to understand, since we are here and we are seeing that, of course, we are investing more and more in renewables, but what are we doing to stop the fossil fuels? So I think this is the big question that we are all here to understand, that it's not so much only pushing renewables, but we need to decarbonize, we need to face down fossil fuels. And this is something that Brazil has a big struggles, big difficulty understanding and pushing for it, because the government is pushing for oil exploration in the Amazon region now. There is a big debate in Brazil going on. We also have big subsidies for fossil fuels in Brazil taking place, although we don't have the formal official number. We have our own estimate, and it's pushing $20 billion annually. So it's a very big commitment to fossil fuels. So I think there is, in terms of transition, we still have a big way forward, the G20 as a whole and Brazil specifically, not only to push renewables, to make sure that this pushing is not comes in the detriment of human rights. This is something that we are already seeing in Brazil, mainly with the wind farms that can be problematic and sometimes are, in terms of violations of human rights. So I think it's very important to make sure that this expansion of renewables don't come to the cost of people. And we need to actually think about and act on fossil fuel reduction and decarbonization of our energy matrix as a whole. Thank you so much, Arti.
Thanks very much, Livy. And, it's as every one of you have spoken, it just feels to me that the situation really is quite tricky, especially if we are talking about this G20 and if we think there is any kind of conversations. There was one question in the chat, and Tara, please feel free to come in, and it was from Reuters, Bhaskar, which really was that in the technical discussions, you can feel that a lot of the focus is still on retaining fossil fuels and they are not going anywhere. And what we are having is pathways to nowhere, not pathways to 2050. That was really the sentiment at the Energy Transition Working Group track meetings. And I suppose that's what he's alluding to. And while here we are making a lot of case for subsidies, it just feels to me that this is not even very much on the agenda. Tara, if you don't mind, and if very briefly, may I ask you to come in and speak a little bit about, given time is very short between when the Leaders Summit will happen, and given how deep and entrenched this problem is, what is the one thing or one message that you'd like to give, especially towards this G20, and given that the energy transition track has already happened? Is there hope for any success or any discussion on this matter?
Thanks, Arti. Yeah, look, the one thing I'd like to see is this on the agenda. I mean, I think it's just flabbergasting that the G20 made this commitment, and now after these vast sort of subsidies are becoming apparent in 2022, that the issue is not even on the agenda. So if I was to ask for one thing maybe for the G20 to do that's sort of within its power as a governing body, so not the individual countries, I would like to see removal of the word inefficient from their commitment, and really just tightening up what they plan to do. You know, they've committed to removing inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. It'd be good to just see a commitment to, eliminating subsidies, except those for the poorest, within a certain time frame. By 2025 would be good for developed countries, because that's what the G7's already committed to, and by earlier than 2030 for the emerging economies, because in fact, under the Sustainable Development Goals, all countries have committed to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies by 2030. So we'd like the G20 to actually show some leadership here and push the level of ambition. This is particularly important because we're in the lead up to COP. So the G20 should not be just seen in isolation. It should be seen as part of a series of meetings that occur throughout the year. And it is really... this COP is controversial, and we're concerned that the level of ambition will not be high given where it's being hosted and the strong fossil fuel interest there. So I think the G20 has a real role to play in saying what can be achieved in subsidy reform, expanding the definition beyond just subsidies to include public financial flows, so SOEs, public finance, and then, real commitments on how this will be implemented along the lines of what Canada has done.
Right. May I ask on state-owned enterprises? I mean, a lot of them are also reorienting. I know, again, from the Indian example, the National Thermal Power Corporation is reorienting itself. It has big plans to set up 50 gigawatts or 30 by 2032. So they have ambitious numbers. And if that is the way the inflection point will come, that the change will only be incremental and not radical, I suppose for large state-owned enterprises, perhaps that could be the way to go as well. But I take your one big message out when you said just phase out the word inefficient, because that really is conflicting to where we are trying to get to. I was seeing some questions in the chat, and you have really answered lots, and I know that we are coming to the top of the hour as well, but if I can also ask you to address one general question. It's also from Urmi at the Economic Times. You have answered one question, but the overarching question is, how concerned should we be with the solutions-oriented pro-fossil fuels approach to decarbonization? Essentially, everything that is being touted as solutions and is not, and if that's the way in which we are taking steps towards decarbonization, how close we will be to where we have to be.
Yeah, look, that's a really good question. And it definitely speaks to what we're seeing at the moment. So we see, explicit fossil fuel subsidies, but we see in countries a move towards support for these supposed clean energy technologies. And it's really a way of perpetuating fossil fuel use. So, what we really need to do is stop getting coal, oil, and gas out of the ground. That's the best way to stop continuing heating of our planet. Just don't get them out of the ground. What we're instead seeing is the fossil fuel industry saying, let's continue to dig up coal, oil, and gas, and we'll just sequester some of the carbon. It can't all be sequestered underground, some of it back underground. These technologies are unproven. There's a project in Australia, the Gorgon Gas Project, that was really only approved because it was going to sequester carbon. And I think only about 25% of what it was promising to sequester has actually been sequestered, because the technology just doesn't work. For years, they were producing gas with no CCS and being allowed to do it. So the whole thing was, a bit of a farce. Now, when these technologies not only perpetuate ongoing fossil fuel use, but then they are subsidized by governments, this is hugely problematic because they're labeled as clean energy and they are not. And it's taking money away from solutions that really would reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And I can see Dayala wants to come in here, and I would really like to hear her response on this as well.
Yes, I fully agree with you, Tara, and yeah, definitely. These are not proven technologies, and they are driving away support and investments where in other places where they should be going. But I also want to add to your point that when we talk about renewable energy, of course, the climate angle is very important, and it's the most pressing issue, one of the most pressing issues today. But also, let's not forget that the energy transition is not only for climate purposes, right? I mean, we still have around 600 million people that don't have access to energy today. We've seen the numbers with the lack of access to clean cooking as well. And renewable energy can provide a solution to that problem. It can also provide a solution to all the developing countries that are not able to develop and that are trapped in their current state of lack of development, even going backwards because of this dependence on imported fossil fuels. So this energy transition is meant to bring a lot of other aspects other than climate, and for those benefits or for those drivers for this energy transition, of course, those technologies are also only just a setback and a diversion away from where the investments and the attention needs to go.
Fairly clear. I think the fact that let CCUS not become a siphon and a sink for where investments that could have gone to clean energy would then go to this kind of thing because it's a new shiny toy and you want to put money in it. It also perpetuates fossil fuels, but I think just stressing about it more on how it's both unproven and it's not scalable to that level, but is the new kid on the block, so to speak. I wanted to ask all our colleagues who have spoken so far on the panel if you have any final remarks or observations to make before I hand over to Tara and to Shruti, because there was lots that has been said. There have been many questions, and I wanted to ask Matthew and Diala and Livy and Nate on if there is anything that you would like to just say and was not said when you were speaking.
Hi there.
Matthew?
Yes, hi. No, I don't have anything related to my my piece of this, but I did just want to say that I found the comments around integration with social policy and dealing with poverty and the effects of energy policy on poor households and taking a more structural approach. Very, very interesting, very encouraging. So I just wanted to lend my support for that line of thinking. I thought it's long overdue.
Noted. Thanks very much. I see there are some unanswered questions in the chat box. May I request the panelists to take a look? If you're able to answer the questions, that's nice. If, however, some questions remain unanswered, then I will request the participants to bear with us. We will come back to you either in a written response or you can be in touch subsequently. But Diala, is the
Thank
hand
you,
new?
Arti. Yes,
Yeah,
it's
okay.
me. I have a question for me in the chat, and I tried to answer it, but I don't know if it went. And anyway, it's a point that anyway I would like to touch upon in any case. So we got a question about taxing importing tariffs on renewable energy technologies. So how does that impact renewable energy deployment? And yes, it's true. We see some countries are taxing equipment, but there's here 2 points, right? So there is one about localizing value chains, and this is a point that we always like to make in IRENA, and it's especially in developing countries that are still in early stages, where we see the energy transition as a sector, or the renewable energy as a sector that can drive economic growth and create jobs. You know, in IRENA we always track renewable energy jobs and of course the percentage of women in jobs, and we see that the sector has a great potential to create jobs, to create local value, especially in countries that are rich in materials and minerals that can go into this technology. So in this case, if taxation of imported equipment is part of a policy mix, as I mentioned, it's always about the mix, is part of a policy mix that is meant to localize value chains, along with other policies that go with supporting the development of a local industry, it does not necessarily need to be a bad thing. And also but it all depends on the mix of policies, and that it is done in a way that has a strategy and a long-term vision, and that aligns with the whole vision of where the country needs to go. And at the same time, on the long run, obviously, this is where we would like to see the sector go, as a sector that is so mature and so independent, and that helps generate income to governments through these taxes, where these revenues that go into the government funds can be used and channeled to increase welfare in other areas that are not, that by then will not be receiving enough funds.
Thanks, Diala. We are inching close to the hour, but the point that you made about the localization of value chains, I suppose that's the topic of one separate webinar. There is so much interest, international, local, there is so much at stake because of all of this. And I suppose the entire conversation on how much you push domestic manufacturing, you give incentives to local production versus how much do you export some of the critical assets is going to be where a lot of the energy transition, the electric mobility conversation will hinge, and certainly want to also look at in conjunction, because clearly we are not living in a world where we are dealing with the issues in separation. It's all a system and it's all connected, as you said very rightly. Thanks very much for your observations. I have to draw this to a close, but before I do that, I want to invite Shruti Sharma, who's the Senior Policy Advisor at IISD, who I would request both to draw this to a close, but as well share her insights and reflections, being the India advisor for IISD. At least I believe, Shruti, there is enough that is going on in your mind, both looking at the data and analysis that you have put out, as well as looking at the political realities of how G20 conversations are shaping up in India, and how much is lost, what could be gained, where opportunities still lie for some kind of success and win in the coming days. Over to you for for your reflections and also to draw this webinar to a close.
Thanks, Aarti. Really, thanks a lot for initiating and guiding us through this insightful session. But also, you've given me a tough job. I think it was a really rich discussion, and I'm really grateful to all the experts and participants for sharing their insights, particularly to all the panelists for their views and all the presenters, especially Tara for the detailed data analysis. I think the conversations today have been both striking with, of course, the amount of data that we see in terms of support flowing to fossil fuels, and also intriguing that we're still expecting stronger commitments to come out of this year's G20 in the lineup to COP, which we as all feel are slightly anxious about. But that sort of expectation is starting to slip away a little bit, given that we saw the Energy Ministerial not reflect fossil fuel subsidies at all in the agenda. We saw the Climate and the Environment Ministerial also not be able to take it up strongly. We didn't see RE targets as much as we'd like to hope that we'd see this. So I'm echoing a little bit on what you put out in the starting, that there is immense value of these discussions, like the one that we just had. And conversations like these do hold significant weight as we sort of approach the final countdown to the Delhi summit. It also helps us to envision and articulate the kind of agreements that we anticipate to see from G20 leaders pertaining to climate, energy, finance. We did see a lot of questions about what is the exact kind of language that we wanted to see, what are the recommendations, do they hold meaning just for this G20 summit, or do they have relevance for even beyond? So there is value in the kind of recommendations that are coming out, but do they hold place in the final summit and the leaders' declaration is anyone's guess. Just to sort of wrap up a little bit on acknowledging the fantastic work that's been put out by the team here. Webinars like these aren't easy to pull off without like colleagues running things very smoothly. So just a special thanks to all our communication colleagues who've been running the operations behind the scenes here, and also grateful to all our partners from different G20 members who've come together and review the findings for this report. It's been a lot of work on the methodology. IISD would also like to thank the governments of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden for their generous support to this publication. And finally, I encourage all of you to read and download the report with the links shared here and sort of continue the conversation with us on our social media platforms. We heard some numbers from Nate also come out, so the conversation will definitely be carrying forward. And lastly, I think just to sum up, I think another question that you asked, Aarti, like many of you, I'm also slightly carrying a sense of anticipation and concern regarding the outcomes of the G20 summit. Nonetheless, I think Tara also put it this way, I remain optimistic and choose not to see the G20's outcomes in isolation, but rather focus on what are the lessons that we can draw in advocating for more ambitious outcomes from COP later in the year. So again, thanks a lot.
Thanks very much, Shruti. Certainly what we are dealing with is not straightforward. It's pretty complex and complicated. Congratulations to IISD once again for putting out a very important report. I see a hand, and as the lead author, you have the last word, Tara.
I just wanted to say thank you, Aarti, for your fantastic moderation, and thank you to all the panelists for joining. Some of them are joining from the American time zone, so coming in at 7 o'clock in the morning, so above and beyond the call of duty, and also to IISD colleagues who helped put together this report. Many people are not authors of the report, but our communications team, people who help organise the production of the report, and organise, our relationship with partners, don't get enough credit for all their hard work. So I just wanted to thank them, and thank you all for coming to this webinar.
Thank you. I hope we can be in touch in the crunch hours of the Leaders Summit and hope to push our message a little bit further. Thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you. Thanks everyone. Bye.